I'm an immigrant to this city, having come here in 1979, and I have all the recollection of kindness and generosity and the politeness of Canadians. But that has deep and profound roots that go back right to the early years of the city. In 1845, the blight struck the potato in Ireland, and a perfectly healthy crop of potatoes in the field at 5 o'clock in the evening could be lying flat the next morning, blackened and starting to rot. And of course, that compounded in 1846 and 47. People ate their seed potatoes, so there was absolutely nothing left to eat. So the only opportunity really was to get out of the country. 98,000 Irish men, women and children set out for Canada in 1847 alone. And from the Canadian perspective, that's the largest single year of migration from any one country in the history of the country, relative to the population of the time, which was about 1.5 million. About 20% of all passengers who left Ireland for Canada died at sea or shortly thereafter upon arrival from typhus or other diseases. Ireland Park on the waterfront really is to commemorate the story of triumph over adversity. And so the sculptures in Ireland Park are facing a city and a country that they will contribute to over the next 170 years. What we wanted to do was to complete that journey. I felt that if we were going to go forward to restore this story to memory, that we couldn't do it on the basis of feel-good history. We had to have academic veracity, and in that process we discovered things we simply didn't know. The population of the city at that time was only 20,000. Between the 8th of June, 47, and the end of September, some 38,565 men, women and children came through the city. Not all were Irish. Some were German, some were Polish, but the majority of them were Irish. So we wanted to know, how did the city respond? And in that process, we discovered that an Anglican doctor had come to the aid of Irish Catholic patients. Dr. George Robert Grosset was an exceptional individual. For an Anglican Protestant physician from an establishment background to be putting his life at risk and to losing his life were Irish Catholics, who in many cases didn't speak English, they spoke Gaelic. He exemplifies all that is positive about getting out of the tribalism of sectarianism and saying, what is the right thing to do? Dr. Rees's Wharf was designated by the city authorities as the wharf to which steamers like the Toronto were to dock. And that is where they built a number of fever sheds, but very quickly they became overwhelmed and inadequate. So Edward McElderry, the triage officer, was sent written instructions. If anyone's showing any signs of typhus, they are not to be permitted to enter the city, and they must be sent up to the fever hospital to his attention. Because of the risk of contagion, the city in 1847 designated the hospital reserve, or the hospital block, which was bounded by King Street on the south, Adelaide Street on the north, John Street in the east, and basically Widmer Street in the west. That area north of, shall we say, the Luma Lightbox today, there was an open field area there, and 12 or 14 open-sided fever sheds were built. They were 70 feet long, 20 feet wide, basically just shelters from rain and sunshine, to relieve the patients in the hospital of an infestation of flies. They strung panels of cheesecloth from the beams of the fever sheds. If you were looking south from Adelaide Street, you would see in the evening lantern light, panels of cheesecloth billowing gently.
The idea behind the Dr. George Robert Grosset Park was to bring a person forward who had been lost in the history of Toronto. As the research unfolded, it became clear that he really represented a major moment of humanitarianism within the history of Toronto. The park itself sits on the last remaining parcel of where both the hospital and the fever sheds were located. The identity of Toronto is somewhat embedded in this tiny plot of land. By commemorating him as well as the other people who lost their lives, that piece of land becomes much more important than just the size itself.
This is the only land left on that block where a memorial can be built. And at 80 by 20 feet, it almost exactly corresponds to the dimensions of one of the fever sheds. We're not aware of any major public memorial in Canada to doctors and nurses who've lost their lives helping migrants in Canada, perhaps in North America. It'll be very different from the quiet contemplative experience of Ireland Park, which is a cemetery without bodies. Grosset Park will be a place to bear witness to immense courage and people making the ultimate sacrifice to help fellow men and women and children.
So the park is about acknowledging a moment of history. It also represents and encompasses the response of the city. When you make a choice about how you act, it becomes what your identity and the character of your place will be. And this community set a precedent of inclusion that then informs the future and to some extent may be why Toronto is the most diverse city in the world.
Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Grosset, Bishop Parr, the two nurses, the hospital orderlies were dead before Christmas, and the triage officer Edward McElderry dies in early October. I mean, these individuals made the ultimate sacrifice, and they did it regardless of the religious creed or political background or nationality of those people who are arriving. That's a very important part of our city's history.
The project really is about producing a visceral experience, and it's within an urban site. And so rather than go to grass and benches and things like that, we really are dealing with hardscapes.
The particular choice of materials and the manner in which we are using them is unprecedented. Glass is a material of today. Granite is a material of yesterday, but we can use both of them in ways never imagined possible.
We've decided to work with a really rich material, granite, dark granite, that is engraved or etched with a scale version of the Kane map in its orientation in the city. The vertical elements that are defining the park are structural glass, and they rise up at slight angles to one another, creating a kind of enclosure. So it means that pedestrians can experience the space of this glass as they walk along the length of the park. The really exciting feature is there's a printing process whereby cheesecloth, which was the original sort of curtain material that was used in the fever sheds, we used photography of actual cheesecloth to animate this glass. So we've printed cheesecloth at a slightly larger scale, flowing through the glass, so it'll feel like you're walking through these kind of flowing curtains.
This patterning, this sense of movement and ephemerality that we hope to achieve in these towering glass structures is very much about capturing a pause, a moment, but the continuity of change and of history. In the same way that walking on those granite surfaces, that horizontal map, you are walking through history.
This is going to be the largest glass installed sculpture in North America. And it's going to be very different, especially after twilight. So when you're standing in Grosset Park, you'll be standing on a map of the city as it was in 1847. And the glass panels will be illuminated, which I think will be somewhat ghostly and interesting. And below the panels of glass will be a series of black granite benches, which will be symbolic of cots. And we will engrave the names of the physicians and nurses and religious community who lost their lives helping the migrants, as well as passages from the Hippocratic Oath.
It's supposed to be experiential, and we always said that we want it to be experienced in multiple ways. You know, if you're in a car driving by, you experience it as a moment of light, particularly at night, because you have these glass panes that are evoking something. You don't know what it is. And then there's the biking by. That's a different speed, it's a different experience of the city. You bike by, you might notice people there, you might notice an aspect of it. And then there's the pedestrian who comes, they may walk through it, they may sit on one of the benches at one point, but they can discover it at a pedestrian scale and at a pedestrian speed.
You are walking in the footprints of those that walk before you and those that will travel those streets and walkways in the future.